Few would have guessed that behind Larry David's seemingly familiar, satirical jokes lay details that shocked the public. In this video, we'll trace the controversial statements, situations, and perspectives where Larry David is believed to have inadvertently or intentionally exposed things that Rob Reiner never wanted to reveal publicly. The story doesn't just stop at the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, but also uncovers complex, unpredictable, and surprising truths. If you're curious to know what exactly caused such a stir, watch the video to the end. Don't forget to like if you find the content thought-provoking, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to continue following us in more dramatic behind-the-scenes Hollywood stories. And then people started asking, how could he have convinced so many people? How could he have persuaded, guided, and cultivated that image for so many years? The whispers weren't accusatory, but they were heavy enough to make the atmosphere stifling. When Larry David stopped speaking in his usual sarcastic tone, people were forced to pay attention. And on that day, outside a quiet office building in Santa Monica, there was no humor left. No sarcastic smiles, no half-serious jokes. Just a man who looked like he'd aged a decade in a very short time, standing silently on the sidewalk, eyes downcast, shaking his head slightly before saying things Hollywood had long avoided. Let's be frank, you didn't click on this story because of some vague rumors. You're here because you sensed something was wrong. And in his own way, Larry David confirmed that feeling. This isn't simply the story of Rob Reiner's death. It's the story of what came before, about those who knew, those who chose to remain silent, and about the lingering burden of guilt Larry is believed to have carried ever since. What haunted him wasn't any of the violence, but the prolonged silence before everything broke. According to those close to him, Larry David never intended to speak out. No media strategy, no press releases, no prearranged stage. But when he realized the story was being distorted, when he saw legal arguments beginning to influence public perception, and when he sensed that Rob Reiner risked being reduced to a distorted image within his own tragedy, Larry could no longer remain silent. In what was described as an emotional moment, he spoke out things he had never shared before, and with that, the entire narrative changed. Because there's one detail many people avoid, an uncomfortable moment, not easy to recount. A dinner, just an ordinary dinner, taken a few weeks before the police showed up at the Reiner family's home in Brentwood. But according to Larry David, that dinner explains so much. And once you hear what Rob Reiner said that night, you'll understand why Larry felt he had no choice but to speak out. It was before the headlines exploded, before the speculation spread, before the word tragedy was repeated so often that it lost its original weight. Just two men, no assistants, no entourage, no Hollywood lights, sitting opposite each other in a small, quiet restaurant. A familiar place where old friends often talk about the most ordinary things. But that night was different. According to Larry, Rob Reiner was no longer the man he knew. Normally, Rob was the life of the room, lively, enthusiastic, always full of opinions. But that evening, he was almost completely withdrawn. The food was barely touched. For hours, Rob just stared at the glass of water in front of him, as if waiting for an answer he himself didn't know how to ask. Larry initially didn't know how to react. He tried to crack jokes, tried to steer the conversation toward lighter topics, hoping to break the tense atmosphere. He told himself it was just the usual anxieties people experience when entering a new phase of life. But as time went on, Larry increasingly sensed that something deeper was at play, an unnameable unease. And that feeling, he believed, lingered for a long time, until it could no longer be ignored. But then Larry realized things weren't that simple. The story was much deeper, much darker. When he gently inquired further, Rob didn't talk about the doctor, nor about work pressure or familiar stresses. What he talked about was fear, not a vague anxiety, not a general feeling of unease, but a very real, very specific fear, tied to the very house he lived in. Rob leaned closer, lowered his voice to almost a whisper, and said something that sent a chill down Larry's spine. He said he wasn't sure who was actually living in that house anymore. That one sentence, according to Larry, completely changed the way he saw things. Larry confessed that his first reaction was to try to downplay the issue. He joked that children these days rarely leave the house, always lurking somewhere. But at that moment, the atmosphere suddenly changed. Rob reached across the table and took Larry's arm. Not violent, not dramatic, but a gesture of utter despair. Larry said it was an unforgettable detail because Rob wasn't the type to touch people. He was calm, controlled, always keeping his distance. Yet that night, something inside Rob was trembling. His grip tightened, and in a hoarse, low voice, in the middle of a quiet restaurant, Rob said he felt like he was being looked at like prey, not like a father. Then he softly uttered a sentence like a prayer. Larry said he was completely stunned. All smiles, all playful reflexes vanished instantly. What he had just heard didn't sound like an exaggeration or a delusion. It didn't resemble unfounded suspicion. It was pain. The feeling of a man who had tried to suppress it for too long and finally couldn't hold it back any longer. Larry recounted that at that moment, he felt like an alarm bell had rung in his head. He knew Rob was giving him something very fragile, something so difficult to say that admitting it felt like a risk. Like many others in the entertainment industry, Larry didn't know what to do with what he'd just heard. He didn't call anyone, didn't ask any more questions, didn't interrogate or pressure anyone. He just went home and tried to convince himself that maybe it wasn't that serious. That choice, he said, stayed with him for years afterward. Because that dinner wasn't just a heavy conversation between two old friends. In retrospect, it felt like a warning, a silent cry for help that he hadn't had the courage to confront. Larry said his silence stemmed from a feeling of not having enough basis, not having clear evidence to do anything. It was a story he told himself for a long time. It helped him move on with his life, avoiding conflict, avoiding chaos, avoiding confronting the pain of others. But now he saw things differently. Not as a single shocking moment, but as a series of disjointed pieces. Small details that had been overlooked, now, when put together, looked like the opening scenes of something very dark. He compared it to rewatching the early episodes of a movie, where things gradually become terrifying once you know what to pay attention to. Larry also recalled another memory that kept returning to his mind. About 6 months earlier, at a large charity gala, while the public saw only the red carpet, the lights, the perfect smiles, and the polished Hollywood image, Larry was backstage, in a quiet waiting room without cameras. Rob was there, Michelle was there, and Nick was there too. He had expected a normal family scene, a few jokes, some laughter before the event began. But what he experienced was completely different. The atmosphere was so tense it was suffocating, not noisy, not argumentative, but a chilling silence that made him uncomfortable. Michelle quietly adjusted her dress, making very small, ordinary movements, while the entire room seemed enveloped in an unnameable sense of unease. Outwardly, nothing seemed unusual, but Nick wasn't standing next to Michelle in the way a close relative would. He stood slightly above her, creating an unnameable distance, enough to make Larry uneasy. Nick offered no help, no questions. Then he leaned down, leaned close, and whispered something. Too quiet to hear, but Michelle's reaction was unmistakable. She flinched violently, not just emotionally, but as if she'd been struck by a sudden blast of cold. Her shoulders tensed before she could regain her composure. It wasn't acting, but an instinctive reaction, the kind of reaction where the body recognizes a threat before reason. Larry said that moment completely changed the atmosphere. The room was no longer a backstage preparation area, but a heavy, suffocating space. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, a photographer walked in. Immediately, Nick burst out laughing. The familiar Hollywood smile appeared almost instantly, radiant, confident, warm, flawlessly perfect. But for Larry, it was a natural charm. It was a performance switched on instinctively, a real-life role. In that moment, Larry realized Nick seemed to have two completely different versions. The public version, the one who knew how to command a camera, how to make everyone around him feel comfortable. And the private version, the one whose mere presence was enough to make Michelle tense. That transition happened frighteningly quickly, like a switch being flipped on and off. Larry couldn't forget that feeling. He didn't speak, didn't intervene, didn't even ask Michelle if she was okay. And later, that silence became his greatest source of anguish. Because deep down, Larry understood a hard truth. People don't react that way if they aren't living in a state of being controlled, manipulated, or constantly afraid. What angered him even more was that he wasn't the only one who sensed that chilling energy. According to Larry, others noticed it too, but they chose to avoid it. They gradually stopped inviting Nick over. They whispered behind his back, exchanging silent messages. But no one told Rob. No one warned him. Everyone pretended everything was fine. The gates of Brentwood remained closed every night, concealing a perfect facade. The public only saw the meticulously manicured lawn, the luxurious house, the powerful director, and the admired family. But Larry said that behind those walls, something had been silently cracking for years. Not just emotions, but other pressures that no one wanted to talk about. Rob had confided in Larry about his financial problems, but from Larry's account, it wasn't the usual hardship of supporting children. Not a few allowances or overspending. He used a word that made the atmosphere heavy: coercion. It didn't begin with grand demands or noisy confrontations, but with small, discreet, carefully calculated requests. Then, over time, things escalated. No longer vague suggestions, but increasingly palpable pressure, tied to the fear of loss and reputation. And that, according to Larry, was the most terrifying part. Not what was said, but what had to be kept silent. Larry said that Nick understood their deepest weaknesses very well. Rob and Michelle were not simply parents. They were an icon, a legacy, an image built and maintained for decades in the public eye. And in Larry's view, Nick had turned that very love, attachment, and loyalty into a tool for pressure. Rob felt trapped in an inescapable vortex, a situation no parent would be prepared to face. Rob had told Larry, in a completely serious tone, that if he cut off contact, the child might collapse, but if he continued to keep things as they were, the family itself would fall apart. Larry called it a terrifying prediction, not the dramatic kind you'd find in movies, but the sigh of someone who foresaw the outcome but didn't know how to avoid it. According to Larry, the story had reached a point of no return. For decades, he built his career by viewing human flaws through a humorous lens. But what he perceived in Nick wasn't just an ordinary flaw. It was a cold void where empathy, remorse, or at least a sense of connection should have existed. Larry recounts a Thanksgiving encounter that still haunts him. Looking into Nick's eyes, he saw no warmth, no gratitude, no repentance. Just an empty, chillingly sober gaze. Larry says you can almost sense the calculations at work behind that gaze. Not emotion, but calculation. What could be achieved next? Who could be exploited? What leverage remained unused? According to him, it wasn't simply ambition or selfishness. It was more like a long-term strategy, unfolding step by step, silently and patiently. And then Larry revealed a detail that made it impossible for him to continue reassuring himself that it was just a matter of money. Because, in his view, it was control. Rob had started locking his bedroom door at night. Imagine that. An elderly man, a renowned filmmaker, living in a large, luxurious house, yet having to lock his door out of fear of his own son. Larry recounted that Rob tried to say it jokingly, as if he were just teasing about trivial worries. But Larry understood exactly what it meant. Rob wasn't afraid of the invisible. He was afraid of something very real, very close, present right in his own living space. Rob lived in a state of constant vigilance, sleepless, and perpetually stressed. And while Rob was slowly breaking down under the weight of worry and exhaustion, Larry said Michelle clung to hope. She was someone who always believed in salvation, always kept the door open, both literally and figuratively. She often said things like it was just a difficult phase, that he needed more time, more love, more understanding. Larry's voice faltered when he mentioned Michelle. He spoke with undisguised pain that she had loved him completely, loved him unconditionally. And Larry believed that it was that very kindness, that boundless forgiveness, that had turned against her. It hadn't eased the situation, hadn't healed anyone, but had inadvertently fueled the vicious cycle that was trapping the whole family. That's why Larry didn't see what happened later as a sudden shock. He didn't believe in a sudden collapse or a momentary impulse. In his view, it was a much colder process, a prolonged erosion, a gradual tightening, occurring over many years, while Nick patiently waited until his parents were weary, weak, and still too hopeful to resist. Larry David says that people often call all of this a tragedy, as if it were unpredictable. But with what he knows and what he has witnessed, he disagrees. In his view, it's not unimaginable. It's something that built up gradually, silently, layer by layer, year after year, while those around them kept reassuring themselves that it was just normal family discord, until it became impossible to hide. And then one day, everything crumbled because of a single word, a short word, yet powerful enough to shatter the illusion that had been maintained for years. No, Larry said there was a project Nick was pursuing with almost absolute obsession. This wasn't a fleeting idea or a naive creative dream. It was a clear, unwavering demand. Nick wanted to be the director, to be at the center, to hold the power, influence, and authority his father had once possessed. And above all, he wanted the name Reiner to be his ticket to every door. According to Larry, Nick wasn't asking for a chance to prove himself. He was demanding a transfer, a kind of inheritance while his father was still alive and well. Rob had objected for a long time, not with anger or coldness, but with reason. He understood what many in the industry avoided. Nick wasn't ready. Mentally unprepared, professionally immature, and emotionally unstable. Larry believed that it was at that very moment, when Rob first truly stood his ground and stated his boundaries, that things took a different turn. Rob said no. And for Nick, it wasn't just an answer. It was the first time in his life he'd been definitively rejected. Rob stated unequivocally that if Nick wanted to be trusted, if he wanted a serious future in the industry, he needed to truly overcome his addiction. Not short, superficial detoxification periods to appease public opinion, but a long, difficult process requiring discipline, humility, and personal responsibility. Larry said Nick couldn't accept that. For someone like him, the word no wasn't a boundary to be respected. It was an insult, a denial of self-worth, a direct threat to the image he had built in his mind. In Nick's mind, everything was predetermined. He believed he was the rightful heir to the legacy, that everything Rob had built up over a lifetime would sooner or later belong to him. Larry saw this bluntly and coldly. He didn't consider what happened to be the result of a moment of impulsiveness or a sudden mental breakdown. To him, it was the consequence of a sense of entitlement, of a distorted belief that he deserved everything, and a calculated reaction when that belief was shattered. Rob's refusal was more than just a statement. It was a mirror forcing Nick to confront a truth he couldn't bear. Larry said that from that moment on, things began to fall apart more quickly, because for Nick, waiting wasn't an option. In his mind, career, reputation, power, it had all belonged to him long ago. Rob, in that distorted view, was merely an obstacle. Larry said that's why he couldn't stand hearing the defense try to portray the story as a sudden collapse. In his opinion, there was nothing unexpected. Everything had been building up, orchestrated, nurtured in silence for years. This wasn't chaos. This was calculated. Years of manipulation, years of subtle pressure, years of living two faces, a glamorous public face and a cold, emotionless one behind closed doors. Larry said the industry was doing its usual thing, softening the story, simplifying things, turning it into an easily digestible tragedy about a troubled son, instead of confronting the far more complex and uncomfortable truth. But he refused to accept that narrative. He wouldn't allow Rob Reiner, a man who had dedicated his life to creativity and kindness, to be rewritten as the villain in his own tragedy. And then Larry shared one final detail, one that made the listener feel as if someone had squeezed their chest, because it showed just how fragile the line between hope and collapse was right before things spiraled out of control. Just 2 days before everything fell apart, Rob called Larry. The call went unanswered. It went straight to voicemail. No message, no sound to cling to, just a deafening silence. Larry didn't call back. He thought maybe the weekend. He was tired, distracted, caught up in the routine. But now, that moment keeps coming back to him. Larry says that looking back, the missed call isn't empty anymore. It has a different tone, as if something was trying to escape but couldn't. An unspoken word. A quiet goodbye. His voice choked as he admitted it. He said he'd never know what Rob meant, but deep down, He believed Rob called for one reason only, to say goodbye. Not in a dramatic or tearful way, but in the way of someone who understood their time was running out. Larry said Rob sensed it, not through reason, but through a vague yet persistent intuition, an intuition that only emerges when things have gone too far. According to Larry, the most painful part isn't what happened inside the Brentwood house. More haunting is what's happening outside of it right now. Since he spoke out, the atmosphere in Hollywood has changed. Not a loud, explosive one, but a quiet, unsettling movement. Whispers have begun to emerge. Not about scandal, but about responsibility, about silence, about how many others also saw the signs of trouble and chose to turn away. Larry says many people don't know the whole story, but they know enough to sense that something is wrong. What nauseates him is seeing those faces flooding social media with broken heart emojis and lengthy, emotional memorials. He stated frankly that it was difficult to accept seeing those who had kept their distance now expressing such grief, as if this tragedy had appeared out of nowhere. In fact, Larry said, just months earlier, these same people had quietly removed Nick from their lives. No more invitations, no more private dinners, no more intimate gatherings. And not because they were worried about Rob or Michelle, but because Nick made them feel insecure. They didn't want to confront that discomfort. They didn't want to be involved in a complicated, tangled, and emotionally heavy issue. Larry said Hollywood only wanted a more palatable version of Rob, a charming, funny, vibrant storyteller, not a tired, stressed, exhausted Rob who perhaps desperately needed someone to ask, "Are you okay?" So instead of helping, they chose to ignore him. They left the Reiner family to fend for themselves in silence. Larry admitted he wasn't blameless either. He said something that resonated throughout studio offices and private dining rooms. "We didn't want to see the nightmare, so we stopped asking questions at home." That statement, he said, tore through the veneer of feigned empathy and forced everyone to confront what Hollywood hates most: the fact that you can be surrounded by hundreds of people every day and still be completely alone when it matters most. He said what hurt him most was realizing that it was the silence that was destroying Rob and Michelle. Not a single moment, but a build-up, months of ignoring, years of polite excuses, moments when someone sensed something was wrong but told themselves they had no right to intervene. Larry said Hollywood is good at the red carpet and condolences, but when it comes to protecting a real person, the only thing they protect is their own comfort. Now, as the trial approaches, Larry is doing something few expected. He's not shying away. He didn't soften his words. He didn't let any team alter his message. He told the truth his way, to the press, to friends, even to strangers who stopped him on the street to ask what had really happened. Larry said it didn't feel like justice. It felt more like atonement. Because when you see the whole chain of events, when you realize how many opportunities there were to change the outcome, you don't find peace. You only find responsibility. And Larry knew, from this moment on, none of them could pretend not to know anymore. The defense began to construct their narrative, painting a chaotic picture: confusion, loss of control, impulsive actions in a fit of anger. But according to Larry, that explanation was completely unconvincing. What he described didn't resemble chaos, but rather a series of calculated choices. Not an accident, not a moment of madness, but a series of deliberate steps. Larry said that if necessary, he was willing to sever all ties in the entertainment industry to prevent that version from becoming the only truth. According to him, Hollywood wasn't paralyzed by grief, but by fear. Fear of what would happen when everything was no longer hidden behind closed doors, but publicly revealed in court records. The trial was fast approaching, and Larry David had made his position clear. He was ready to testify. That image made many pause and think. Larry David on the witness stand, no sarcasm, no humor, no familiar coldness to mask his true feelings. Just a friend speaking frankly about the prolonged decline in the life of someone he was once very close to. According to Larry, this trial could become one of the most shocking events Hollywood has faced in years, not only because of the reputations of those involved, but because of what it might expose about the system itself. Nick's legal team understood that. Because Larry wasn't the type of witness who could be easily manipulated or overshadowed by clever words. He was someone who looked straight ahead, said what he believed to be true, then paused before speaking on his own. Larry didn't need money, wasn't seeking attention, and had no professional motives to achieve. And it was precisely this nothing to gain that made his words so terrifying to many. What Larry shared, according to him, wasn't just hearsay or fleeting emotion. It was his perspective on the underlying motives. He didn't believe in the scenario of a sudden mental breakdown or an uncontrollable tragedy. Instead, he spoke of greed, a sense of power, and a long-standing lack of compassion. Then Larry offered a sharp argument, enough to shake up the entire defense strategy. If the story was based on panic and instability, then simply proving what he implied, shady deals, underhanded pressure, subtle threats, money transfers, would shatter the out-of-control argument. In Larry's words, people who truly lack self-control wouldn't negotiate, wouldn't strategize, wouldn't plan. He called Nick a chameleon, someone who could perfectly adapt to any environment. When needed, he could make the whole room feel comfortable. Charming conversation, movie quotes, political discussions, timely handshakes, appropriate laughter. But according to Larry, the moment he got what he wanted, that warmth vanished quickly. The charm faded, revealing a much colder version of himself. It was this sudden change, he believed, that truly frightened Rob, because no one knew who would walk through the door when it opened. Who can walk into a room and freeze the atmosphere in seconds. Larry says that's what haunted him for months. And then he shared a final memory, a small but unforgettable moment. Just a few months ago, Larry was sitting with Rob and Nick watching a Lakers game. The team was losing. The atmosphere was the usual sports-related disappointment. But then Nick uttered a short, sharp remark that changed everything. Not a joke, not harmless annoyance. There was something in his voice that made the room sink, even though the TV was still blaring. Larry says he immediately realized the remark wasn't really about basketball. It was like a crack revealing another dark corner, a thought that made Rob quietly turn away, as if unwilling to face it. Nick said that players who play like that deserve to be punished. In the context of sports, many might consider that just a typical outburst. But Larry knew it wasn't like that this time. When he looked over, Nick wasn't smiling, shrugging, or joking. His eyes were fixed on the screen, cold and focused, like a predator silently observing its prey. Rob sensed it too. Larry remembered reaching for the remote and changing channels almost reflexively. No one said anything. Not because the game was no longer interesting, but because Larry was trying to defuse the atmosphere, to keep things from spiraling out of control. He said he was walking on eggshells, adjusting every small gesture to maintain the fragile peace in the room. I saw Rob shrink back, Larry said, his voice low. A man who was once an icon, who once commanded the entire set, now huddled on the sofa, worried about his own son's mood. That image, Larry said, shattered a very common illusion, that fame, success, or money can protect you from personal storms. Rob had everything outsiders could dream of, a brilliant career, respect, power, and a seemingly perfect family. But none of that was enough to shield him from the growing danger within his own home. Larry says this story doesn't end with a case or legal arguments. It just takes on a different form. While the public is caught up in the headlines and court proceedings, another form of trauma is unfolding silently, without cameras or news articles. It's the pain of the remaining children, Romy and Jake. Larry calls them the strongest people he knows right now, but also the most deeply wounded. They didn't just lose their parents in an instant. They witnessed the breakdown unfold little by little over many years. Every argument, every unreasonable demand, every harsh word left a scar. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow erosion. Larry said that Nick didn't destroy Rob and Michelle overnight. The damage had accumulated over nearly a decade, with each manipulative act, each tense silence, each time they had to compromise to maintain peace. Little by little, the peace was drained from that house, until the familiar light was gone. At this point, Larry choked up. He recalled Rob Reiner as an outstanding actor and director, a face that had shaped the entertainment industry for decades. Michelle Singer Reiner, in his opinion, was also a talented and impactful figure in her field. And then Larry said what troubled him most. All of this, in his opinion, shouldn't have happened. He believed the tragedy could have been prevented. If only one person had been brave enough to speak up sooner. If only one serious call had been made. If only there had been real intervention. Not superficial solutions, not cover-ups or silent agreements, but clear boundaries and real consequences. If that had happened, Larry believes Rob and Michelle might still be here today. But ultimately, silence prevailed. The fear of embarrassment won. The fear of media scrutiny. The fear of being seen as overreacting. The fear of breaking Hollywood's unwritten rule, protecting one's image at all costs. Larry says that the obsession with appearances, the instinct to smooth things over and keep the picture looking perfect, crossed the line. It not only covered up the problem, but silently nurtured it to grow. And now, he says, the entire industry is finally forced to confront the question every parent dreads. When does help turn into indulgence? And when does love begin to become dangerous? Larry doesn't claim to have the answer, but he's determined not to let people continue pretending that the question doesn't exist. Because that very denial, that polite silence, that decision to stay out of it, paved the way for the tragedy to unfold from the very beginning. Then, Larry recounts his final visit to the Brentwood house. The police tape still blocked the entrance. Flowers, letters, and candles piled up in front of the gate. But Larry said he didn't look at the memorials. He didn't read the cards. He didn't pay attention to the headlines. His gaze rested on the house itself, on the silent walls behind the gate. And then he uttered a sentence that silenced those around him. Those walls weren't built to keep outsiders in. They were built to keep the nightmare inside. That statement wasn't just about a specific house. It exposed an entire culture that had allowed things to spiral out of control. Everyone saw the signs. Everyone chose to remain silent. The nightmare was hidden, unquestioned, uninterrupted, until it was too late to turn back. But Larry said that now, something was shifting. Since he spoke, it felt like a curse had been broken throughout the city. People were starting to talk for real. It's not about fame or status, but about fear, about silence, and the price of pretending everything is okay when it's not. In Hollywood, according to Larry, silence isn't just awkward. It's a protective shield. It's the rule that keeps the system running, keeps reputations intact, and keeps uncomfortable truths buried beneath movie premieres, charity galas, and red carpet smiles. But as soon as he started speaking, cracks began to appear. Doors that had been closed began to open. Larry believed that more voices would emerge. Not just from the familiar faces in front of the cameras, but from the people always behind the scenes. The servants, assistants, drivers, those who witnessed the chaos up close but were never allowed to speak. He said that soon, the public would hear the real stories: damaged walls, phones thrown in anger, early morning screams that neighbors chose to ignore because it was easier to turn a blind eye than to confront them. Larry emphasized that he wasn't speaking out for fame or sympathy. He was doing so because he couldn't continue living with the lies. The way this crisis was wrapped in polished statements and a masterful silence unsettled him. There was no room for polished words or distorted truth. Only the naked truth remained. Confessions laid bare before everyone. From afar, one might call it grief. But Larry said, for him, it was something far deeper. It was repentance. A belated, almost desperate attempt to mend what had fractured after so many years of turning a blind eye. And Larry says there's one crucial detail most people miss: the timeline. While the public believed Rob Reiner was slowing down, perhaps preparing for retirement, perhaps losing interest in the craft, Larry argues the opposite. The sporadic interviews, the absence of new projects, the feeling that the creative flame had died out. These weren't signs of artistic exhaustion. They were signs of a man worn down by constant crisis. Larry says Rob wasn't leaving Hollywood. He was struggling to maintain control of his life. 24 hours a day, Rob was just trying to keep things from falling apart. And then Larry uttered a statement so heavy it left no room for solace or escape. Their loss is a tragedy, and we have a responsibility to bring the perpetrator to justice. He said, try to be funny, try to be creative. When you live in fear that your own son could destroy the whole family if you don't transfer the money by noon. That's what Larry wanted people to truly understand. According to him, this wasn't just grief. This was control. A suffocating, Prolonged pressure had drained all joy from Rob's life, until the person the world once knew had almost vanished. Larry believed that when the financial evidence came to light, it would be a fatal blow to the defense strategy. Because those transactions, those messages, those demands, those threats didn't reflect chaos. They reflected intent. They showed preparation, calculation, and clear awareness. A cold and deliberate manipulation. Larry repeatedly emphasized that Nick hadn't lost control. He repeated it over and over, as if trying to engrave it into the very truth. Nick was charming when it worked and ruthless when it didn't. He could be sweet in front of a crowd, menacing when alone, then back to square one. A chameleon changing its form to suit its purpose. And Larry said that mask didn't fall off just once. It fell off, then put back on, again and again. Rob saw it. Michelle saw it. The whole family felt it. But they still tried to soothe the pain with love, still believed that compassion could heal what was destroying them from within. And it was at this moment that Larry's story shattered one of Hollywood's most comforting myths, that success equals safety. He said that was wrong. Fame doesn't protect you. It only builds higher walls to hide the pain. Larry called this a Shakespearean tragedy. A king and queen are ruined by a prince who wants to seize the crown too soon. And Larry, the clown, whose whole life has turned tragedy into laughter, is now the only one to speak the truth. In the haunting final scene, Larry recounts the moment he leaves the Brentwood house. No cameras, no staging, no pretense. He doesn't look at the flowers or letters at the gate. He just quietly turns away, carrying a burden no joke can lighten. Because, as Larry says, Rob cried for help, but it was a silent cry. A silence so great that no one heard it, until it was too late. And this time, Larry said, there was no room for laughter. The silence was finally broken, and what filled that void was anything but gentle. It was loud, jarring, and impossible to ignore. Larry said breaking the silence was never the end. It was only the beginning. Because as soon as the first words were uttered, they spread throughout Hollywood like an earthquake. Phones started ringing incessantly. Texts poured in. Secret meetings took place behind the closed doors of studios. Agents panicked. Producers scrambled for lawyers. And old friends suddenly vanished, erasing all traces, pretending they were never close enough to know the Reiner family. But Larry didn't back down. He said he was tired of watching history being rewritten while everyone wore a mask of grief. In his opinion, it wasn't grief. It was fear. Fear that with a single pull of a thread, the whole fabric would unravel. And that's happening right now. The polished image of the industry is beginning to crack, revealing something far from pretty underneath. Larry says there are powerful people, big faces, who knew about Nick's behavior years ago. They heard the rumors. They saw the tension. They recognized the manipulation. But instead of intervening, they turned away, afraid of losing relationships, afraid of offending people they shouldn't offend. Now, those same faces are appearing everywhere in the media, offering sympathy, feigning shock, as if it were all a sudden shock. Larry says it's just a familiar performance, a PR stunt Hollywood always uses to protect itself. He bitterly says they'd be willing to make a film celebrating Rob's genius before acknowledging how many people chose to ignore his pain. They'll turn tragedy into content before turning it into responsibility. And then Larry said something that silenced the room completely. The truth wouldn't stop with me. It would spread. Because when Larry dared to speak up, others began to find their voices again. Whispers turned into outright words. Assistants, neighbors, old friends, those who had witnessed warning signs that no one wanted to talk about before, were no longer pretending. Larry said he'd seen this scenario before. Hollywood always relied on nostalgia, always manipulated collective memory to protect its glamour. But this time was different. The mask was falling, and the world was seeing it happen right now. Perhaps that was the real turning point. Not the case, not the headlines, but the fact that one person's pain finally exposed what decades of rumors couldn't. The truth, Larry said, wasn't about the scandal. It was about complicity. He admitted he couldn't save his friend anymore. But if people started speaking the truth, perhaps there was still a chance to save others. Then he looked directly at the person opposite him and whispered, almost pleadingly, that this time, please, don't wait until it's too late. Larry said the aftermath was stranger than he had ever imagined. The city that once laughed at his jokes now dissected his every word. Talk shows, podcasts, tabloids turned the pain into a topic of discussion. But Larry didn't care anymore. Let them talk. At least this time, they were talking about something real. Because the feeling was different now. The silence that had once sheltered everyone was crumbling. Former employees were starting to speak. Neighbors were starting to speak. And even those within the film industry itself were no longer keeping silent. Those who had sworn to keep their secrets for life are now quietly reaching out to reporters. Each new account emerges like a piece of a puzzle, adding detail to a picture already fractured. The stories don't stand alone, but follow one another, creating the feeling that something has been overlooked for too long. That picture gradually unfolds, a family struggling desperately, trying to be heard, while outside, the world continues to applaud incessantly. Larry admits feeling overwhelmed, as if living in the midst of a storm he inadvertently helped create. Each day brings new information, another message, another witness, and another disturbing truth. But throughout it all, he emphasizes one thing. This isn't a story of revenge. It's a story of responsibility. He wanted the public to stop embellishing the pain, stop turning tragedy into entertainment, and start asking why things had gone this far. Is it only when a major event occurs that people stop to listen? Larry called it a bitter paradox. Hollywood, which thrives on storytelling, failed to recognize the true story unfolding right before its eyes. For years, the signs were ignored because the truth was too convoluted, too inconvenient, and too raw. But now, everything has been exposed, and no script can cover it up anymore. Friends advised him to step back, take care of himself, and let his lawyers and media team handle the rest. But he refused. If he stopped now, he said, everything would be rewritten in the same old way. And this time, the story wouldn't just be distorted about others, but about him. He believed it wasn't over yet. There were still unpublished documents, unheard recordings, and people still trying to silence everything. But the situation had changed. Each time someone spoke up, Larry felt the power of lies diminish. He paused, his voice low but firm. Rob had once believed in stories, believed that truth could be conveyed through laughter. Therefore, perhaps the best way to respect that wasn't through satire, but through honesty. As the city prepared for days of heightened tension, Larry stood there alone, not as a comedian, nor as a celebrity, but as a man who refused to let silence prevail. His words now sounded less like gossip and more like a demand for justice. This story began with silence and ended with the truth being revealed. It's not just about someone opening up to their pain, but the moment the curtain of a world accustomed to concealment is drawn back. Hollywood no longer laughs, but is forced to listen. Every word uttered becomes a reminder, forcing people to look beyond the glittering headlines and wonder what is truly happening behind those polished walls. And then the question is posed to all of us. Could things have been different if the early warning signs hadn't been ignored? Do we need more voices that dare to take responsibility instead of choosing silence? This isn't just the story of one family or one individual. It reflects how easily people turn their backs on the truth until it's too late. The silence has been broken, and what remains is to ensure it never has the chance to engulf us again. Thank you for watching the video until the very end. Your support and companionship are the greatest motivation for the channel to continue delivering insightful, well-crafted, and responsible content. If you found this video valuable or thought-provoking, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. All your comments and opinions are greatly appreciated. Thank you sincerely, and see you again in future content.